welcome to planet Earth, home to many different creatures, snails, fish, dogs, and of course us, humans.
Parkour!
But more importantly, home to Germany, Bochum, the birthplace of Piranha Bytes. Year 1997, Michael, Tom, Stefan, and Alex all come up with a brilliant idea of creating an action role-playing game for the PC, completely unaware that the game they worked on would become the epitome of action role-playing games for years to come, or at least for Eastern Europeans, that is. October 2001, Gothic 1 is officially released on the European black market. The game was as atmospheric and immersive as it was buggy. But this didn't stop the neighborhood pirates from creating bootleg copies of the game and making more profit selling it to the poor neighborhood kids than the developers themselves. But that's neither here nor there. Gothic 1 was a success, receiving generally favorable reviews. 7 from GameSpot, 8 from Metacritic, and 8 from IGN. Many years later, YouTubers started reviewing it as well, also recommending it.
Is Gothic worth playing? Absolutely. It's flawed, but the world was so rich and there was so much to interact with that I couldn't help but get lost in it. I put in a dozen hours before even touching the main quest. That time alone was well worth it. Is Gothic worth finishing? Maybe.
And while nigh impossible to run on modern day systems without installing some extras first, back in the day it was a visually impressive game with satisfying enough combat, if a little unrefined. Take a look at some of these combat scenes.
He's had enough! Ah, a fight!
A fight!
Not too shabby for 2001, right? You started out as just some guy who never went through any combat training in his life, and while no able-bodied man would hold a short sword this way, it is portrayed like this to show progression, which is later polished in the sequel. When you leveled up and found a trainer for hand-to-hand combat, your character's swings became far more coordinated. Suddenly, everything became far more manageable. That's the kind of progression that we all enjoyed. It felt really good to completely change the way you approach battles. Faster animation, combo, more responsive controls. It all came together nicely and gave us a sense of progression. Real, visible progression, not just numbers on a character screen. Now, let us fast travel to the year 2005. Gothic 2 Gold is here. While the sequel was initially released in November 2002, just a year after Gothic 1, the selfish Deutschfolk didn't share it with the rest of the world until June 2003. And while we were playing the standard version of Gothic 2, the Germans already had their hands on the much needed expansion, Night of the Raven, which added a bunch of new stuff to the game. Sure, Gothic 2 was a vast improvement over its predecessor, but it was the Night of the Raven that truly made it into the icon that it is today. Piranha Bytes improved almost every aspect of the game. The graphics looked far better, we got a bigger world to explore, less bugs, better UI, control scheme, and finally, a more polished combat system. While Gothic 1 wasn't easy per se, in the first half at least, Gothic 2 Night of the Raven cranked up the difficulty to Dark Souls levels. They also revamped the way stats were handled, and so now you could take some of the strongest enemies in the game at level 0, provided you were willing to sacrifice your sanity and risk permanent nerve damage. Combat was far more engaging now, and you actually had to move around on the battlefield. No longer could you block monsters' attacks by holding your weapon up. You actively had to dodge and maneuver whenever necessary to achieve the sweet, sweet victory. Fuck you, orc. Fuck you, skeleton. And while there were plenty of areas that were technically way out of your league, the game provided you with the means to handle even those at the lowest levels, as long as you got creative. I am sure I'm not the only one who remembers how good it felt to purchase Reign of Fire in Corinthus and make your way into the nearby forest to assert absolute dominance over the poor unsuspecting orc labradors. Anyway, I'm getting off track here. Let's take a look at some of the early battles we do in the game. We no longer hold a weapon like we had a few extra chromosomes. It's all more fluid and responsive, but then you leveled up and look, again, different, faster animation. Investing skill points in combat training, as well as strength, was even more vital to your success than in the first game. Every time you leveled up your one- or two-handed skill, chances to do critical damage increased, and it was extremely well optimized. In most video games to date, at about halfway point through the game, everything just becomes too easy. With each passing hour, you feel more and more like an invincible demigod, capable of shattering the enemy faction just by looking at them. Not in Gothic 2. Until the very end, enemies pose a real threat. It's a fine line, I think, to make the game challenging up until the very end without making the player feel like the grind was completely meaningless. And yet Piranha Bytes achieved the seemingly impossible at the time. Unfortunately, sooner or later, all good things come to an end. And little did we know at the time, it would be sooner rather than later for Piranha Bytes and their games. For Gothic 2, Night of the Raven was the last great game they would release. Nevertheless, future looked bright, and as soon as they announced Gothic 3, people started placing their pre-orders. Next slide, please. October 2006, the game is out. And just how good is it? Is it everything we dreamt and hoped it would be? Well, no, for you see, Piranha Bytes was being pressured by the publisher, Yowood, to stick to the release date despite them clearly needing more time. Ultimately, because of the corporate greed, we never received a worthy successor to Gothic 2. The fanbase was not happy. We were all cheated out of our money. The game was nowhere close to being finished. And in later interviews, it was revealed that the reason combat system was such a mess was because Piranha Bytes had no time to do what they claimed to have wanted to. Of course, there was a myriad of other problems with the title, like the bugs, disregard for the lore, uninspired and often anticlimactic main quests, or how good of a PC you really needed to enjoy the game under higher settings. It wasn't all bad though, because in 2006, this game looked marvelous. And despite devouring your RAM like an insatiable hog, there were virtually no loading screens at any point in the game. Kai Rosenkrantz also made sure we always had a wonderful and immersive music accompanying the nameless hero. Back to combat. Suffice to say, Gothic 3 failed terribly at delivering a satisfying combat system, which was of course a big issue with the game, since the world was so enormous and filled with enemies. Whenever you engaged in battle with anything, wildlife, orcs, humans, demons, it was all the same. Just right click, right click, right click, right click. It felt like you were playing a clicker game, which I highly doubt Gothic 3 was meant to be. The orcs, who were the main antagonists, were far easier to defeat than a couple of wolves or boars because of the broken attack animations. Just think about it. It was easier to kill 5 orcs, who were supposed to be far stronger than humans, than a few wild animals. Let that sink in. In 2007, it all reached a boiling point, and Piranha Bytes cut ties with Yowood, leaving their IP in the hands of the corporate suits. Now, before we continue the journey with Pluto 13, let me just go on a quick tangent. Corporate overlord Yowood wasn't ready to let things go at the time, because Gothic 2 Gold was their best-selling title. How did they do it? Pondered the CEO. Maybe we could have one of our lesser developers make an expansion to Gothic 3, like Piranha Bytes did with the previous game. As always, Hans, effing brilliant.
Hello, Trine Games. May I speak with the manager, please? Hello, Abdul speaking. How may I assist you today? Hello, Abdul. It's Jürgen from Yowood. We want you to create an expansion for Gothic 3 because the original devs have abandoned us. I understand. Yes, Jürgen. We would be happy to do this for you.
And thus, Gothic 3 Forsaken Gods is released on the market in 2008. Jürgen and Abdul shake hands, ready for the piles of cash this will bring them. But boy, were they wrong. You see, If you thought that Gothic 3 was a buggy mess, then you were in for a treat, because the Forsaken Gods expansion was a cesspool filled to the brim with bugs, poor writing, and various technical shortcomings. Let us briefly take a look at what was in store for the already dwindling fanbase. Oh, and here is the final boss fight. Needless to say, it was a clear downward spiral for the series. Then, 2 years later, in 2010, another Gothic game was published under Yearwood's watchful eye. Arcania Gothic 4, made by Spellbound Entertainment, which, funnily enough, also struggled financially, similarly to Trine Games. But that's neither here nor there. They also released an expansion for the game called Fall of Setarith, but no matter how much Yearwood continuously tried to milk the once brilliant saga, it was evident that Gothic was dead, reanimated by the corporate greed, devoid of any substance, nothing but a shell, an empty husk of what it once was and what it once stood for. Unsurprisingly, not long after Arcania came out, in 2011, Yearwood declared bankruptcy.
I declare bankruptcy!
Pack your bags, guys and gals, and jump aboard. We're getting back on track now. October 2009, Piranha Bytes releases their new IP, Risen, a brand new action RPG from our favorite developer. What could possibly go wrong? Well, despite the game technically being a new intellectual property, it borrows rather heavily from Gothic 1 and 2. 3 main factions, check. Stuck on an island with no idea where to go, check. You start as a waste of skin, also check. And so, while generally speaking the game was a success, receiving scores between 7 and 8, some people were saying that this is just a blend of the first Gothic games with a fresh coat of paint. But enough of this nonsense. You're here to see the evolution of combat in these games after all. So, let's dive right in. It's different! They improved it! And the reason I say it with such a sarcastic overtone is because while in theory they did in fact scrap the whole clicker bullshit theme from Gothic 3, it just feels off. Here, look at Gothic 2 again, fluid, and definitely more enjoyable than this. Something's wrong with these attack animations. They're very stiff, unnatural, and while dialogue, quests, and exploration were supposedly the main draw of the game, the same should have been true for combat. Because you see, the island was quite big and filled with enemies in every nook and cranny, and therefore, in my opinion, more thought should have been put into it. Especially when you consider that games like Fable and Demon's Souls were already around, basking in the praise they have rightfully received. It was difficult to enjoy this after you have already experienced this. Of course, I understand that they're all very different games, but at the same time, they all rely heavily on customizing your character as well as on fighting a variety of different enemies. It is therefore my belief that if you're creating a game focused primarily on melee combat, you should produce something of greater quality. Nevertheless, having received favorable reviews, Piranha Bytes pushed onwards to further hone their action role-playing game making skills.
With a Z.
April 2012, Risen 2 Dark Waters comes out, and unsurprisingly, it doesn't fare quite as well as the first installment in the series, receiving scores of only 6 to 7. Oh, and it released with a price tag of $50. While the studio was always keeping up with the visual trends, it was apparent that they were incapable or unwilling to adapt to the ever-increasing standards of the industry when it came to some other aspects of their game. Have a gander at the combat system implemented in Dark Souls, released 7 months before Risen 2. Now, let's take a look at The Witcher, which came out in 2007. Fast forward to May 2011, and we get The Witcher 2, Assassins of Kings, which still to this day looks gorgeous, and doesn't feel or play like something from the bygone era, unlike Risen 2, which seemed to be stuck in the old ways, rooted far too deep in Piranha Bytes' lack of innovation. Many people started asking questions. Why aren't you fixing the combat system? What's up with the clunky animations? Why did you decide to abandon magic and make the sequel revolve around pirates and guns? This is getting old. August 2014. Risen 3 Titan Lords emerges from the depths of Germany with the promise of going back to the roots, bringing magic back along with other fantasy themes. Unfortunately, it's doing about as well as its predecessor, with scores averaging from 6 to 7. For just $50, this game can be yours. That used to be the cost of a AAA game, and as internet historian said in his No Man's Sky video,
price tags set expectations.
Dark Souls 2, which came out 5 months before Risen 3, was the same price. Piranha Bytes is not a massive studio, I understand that, but I believe that you should charge for the product that you're actually delivering, not one that you would have liked to deliver. Am I right, Bethesda? To put things further into perspective, Dark Souls 3, which was released 2 years later, was the same price, $50. The Witcher 3, released 1 year before that, was $60. If you're going to charge your audience pretty much the same price tag as the big boys, you should deliver a product that can compete with others in the same price range. There is nothing wrong with producing a smaller game. On the contrary, in fact, it would have been far better for Piranha Bytes to create something of a lesser magnitude, with more emphasis on polish and immersive gameplay. You don't get far in this or any industry by half-assing all your products. You get somewhere by delivering great titles time after time. Anyway, back to the game itself. Remember what I said about the studio keeping up with the visual trends? Well, for Risen 3, that is apparently no longer the case, as it somehow manages to look worse than the previous game. The textures look better, sure, but they oversaturated the shit out of this, and it now looks like a cheap Korean MMO. But I digress. How is the combat? Surely they have learned from their mistakes by now. Having gained a lot of experience in creating these types of games and the amount of feedback they received from the community, well, I'll let the footage speak for itself. How in the world was this combat system still a thing? Even the hardcore fans started getting tired of this nonsense. Slow, unresponsive, animations clunky as ever. Thankfully though, that was the last Risen game to be produced. Slide 3 please. What's that? Is that a plane? Is that a bird? No. It's the announcement of Elex, a new IP from Piranha Bytes, the creators of the original Gothic saga. Ah, at last, the fanbase breathed a sigh of relief. We were teased with various screenshots, endlessly. Noise, it looks good. A modern open-world RPG from Piranha Bytes. There is no way that after 20 years of experience in making such games, the combat would still be atrocious, especially in a completely new game. Nuh-uh. First, they released what seemed to be a music video, featuring Jason Statham. And then, they showed us some alpha gameplay footage. And oh dear lord. What the fuck?! The game itself looked good, but the fucking animations are seemingly as shitty as ever. Not to worry, we told ourselves. It's the alpha version after all. Surely things will improve before they release the game, and we will finally be able to play a Gothic-esque type of game once more. In the months and years leading up to the release of Elex, most of us had already played through titles such as The Witcher 3, Horizon Zero Dawn, or Dark Souls 3. And while they're all rather different types of games, they all had one thing in common: a decently designed, fluid, and enjoyable combat system. Fast forward to October 2017. The wait is finally over. Elex is out. How is the combat? How is it? Did they rework it? Please tell me it's better. I'm afraid it is not. It's as poor and unintuitive as we could have expected. It's pretty much copy and paste from Risen 3, with the addition of gunplay, which aside from a few exceptions feels largely the same, be it a crossbow or a rifle. Back to close quarters. Melee is awful. There are prompts in the middle of combat now. Fan-freaking-tastic. Hitboxes are an absolute joke. I have no words for this. Look at the first 2 fights in the game on ultra difficult. Surely there are better ways of making the game harder than just quadrupling the amount of health on every enemy. But here is perhaps the worst crime Piranha Bytes committed. The combat doesn't change. The way your character fights at the beginning is the exact same way he fights towards the end. Nothing is different. Nothing improves. Except of your knowledge on how to exploit the AI, because at its core, that's what I felt combat in Elex was about. It was never about gradually improving your character's fighting skills. It was never about overcoming difficult but fair challenges. Sadly, it all boiled down to cheesing through the first half of the game and then obliterating everything in the second half with little to no difficulty. Remember how I said that in Gothic, we as the player felt like we were improving our character? The way he fights? None of that is present in Elex. Hardcore fans would continue to defend the game, saying that combat is a secondary feature, that the main focus is on the story and exploration. I politely beg to differ. In a world as vast as that of Elex, exploration is key. That part is true. But what do you encounter on your travels? That's right, enemies. Enemies in every part of the world. So, you have 2 choices before you. Either suffer like I did and try playing the game normally while slowly developing PTSD, or take Seth's advice.
Piranha Bytes is a developer that's infamous for designing terrible combat, so don't be surprised. In fact, if you play by the rules set by the developer, you will die. Instead, you need to do what all sensible people do with Piranha Bytes RPGs. You abuse the system as much as possible.
By the way, I'm not even going to comment on the AI, as that's a topic for a separate discussion. Now, I don't want to finish the video on such a negative note, so let me say this. I've loved Gothic 1 and 2. I played through them both countless times in my childhood, and while I wasn't the biggest fan of Gothic 3, I still enjoyed it to a certain extent. Risen 1, in my opinion, was the only good game out of that trilogy. And yet, despite that, I still have faith in Piranha Bytes. Why? I don't know. Maybe I'm just naive. But I believe that if they listen to the feedback they have received, they may yet make a comeback with Elex 2 by polishing, seasoning, and perfecting every aspect of the game. Bigger is not always better, and a smaller game world would allow them to focus their efforts on improving it. Look at what made Gothic 2 such a fantastic game, and learn from that, Piranha Bytes. Maybe then you will give us a game that we have all been waiting for over 15 years. Fire.